Well, hello. Good evening from here in New Jersey. Good morning to all my friends down in Australia. I'm Larry Rosin, president of Edison Research, and I can't tell you how excited I am to present to you the results of this year's Infinite Dial Australia study. It's been quite a year, and I so wish I could be down there presenting to you in person and see all of my friends in Australia again. Sadly, that's not going to be the case. Let's hope that perhaps by next year I'll be down amongst you all again. But we have the technology, and this is a good substitute. And again, we'll make our way through a pretty entertaining 20-minute webinar right now with lots of fresh findings. I want to start by thanking the sponsors of Infinite Dial Australia, in particular CRA, Commercial Radio Australia, who stepped up this year to become the major sponsor of the study. We needed some extra help, and CRA stepped up, and I can't tell you how much we thank them for doing so. The other sponsors are Listener, the podcasting arm of our friends at SCA in Australia, and then our wonderful partners, Triton Digital, who work on Infinite Dial Australia and on these Infinite Dial projects around the world. If anytime during tonight's webinar you have questions, the Q&A box in Zoom is live. There's a team of people waiting on your questions, and we'll try to get back to you immediately. We'll also leave the box open for a little while after the webinar, so if you have questions at the end, you can type them into the box and we'll get to you straight away. If you're watching this webinar later on and the Q&A box isn't active, you can always contact us at info@edisonresearch.com. That's INFO at edisonresearch.com, and we'll answer your questions there. With all that, let's get started. And like I said, I'm very excited to present the results of this year's Infinite Dial Australia. Okay, so let's start by walking through a little outline of what I'm going to be doing today. We'll start with an overview of the study and the methodology that we employed. We'll then go into a section about usage of online audio in general. We'll delve into some statistics about radio, both live and on demand. In-car media, what people are using in their cars, which will be interesting given the changes over the last year. And then the two hottest topics in the world of audio. We'll start with podcasting, where we have some really interesting data for you. Anyone interested in podcasting in Australia, I think might be excited by what they see. And then smart speakers, the other really hot topic in the space, and lots of development there as well. We'll wrap up with looking at some specific brands in the online audio space and streaming services and what's changed there. And then finally, I'll add a couple observations on the data that we've seen, and we'll talk about what we think happened in the last year. So, like I said, start with a little overview of what this is. This study is exploring the penetration of online digital audio in Australia, as well as the different platforms and technologies that Australians are using today. It's based on a series of studies we've been doing in the United States, going all the way back to 1998, believe it or not. It's the longest study of its kind in the United States. And we cover all the same things here in Australia that we're covering in the United States, and so that we can compare the results from the United States to Australia. This is the 5th year we've done it in Australia, and like I said, it's designed to allow for direct comparisons between the two markets, and those are particularly interesting, I think, in this year's presentation. How we did the study: in the first quarter of this year, we conducted a national telephone survey of 1,000 Australians aged 10 and over. The results I'm going to show today are among those 12 and over, so that we can compare it equally with the US Infinite Dial, which is a 12 plus study. And the data, as is appropriate, is weighted to the national 12 plus population figures for Australia. So, like I said, let's start with some data about online audio. We have a big jump year on year in online audio listening. This is the percentage of people who say they've engaged in any kind of online audio usage in the last month before we called them for the survey. And you can see that over the 5 years that we've done the study. And the numbers have been going up, and they went up significant amount in the last year. And I think right from the jump here, we see some of the impact of the disruptions of the last year, people spending more time at home, disruptions in their lives. And I think it caused people to explore new opportunities and use certain internet-based technologies and services that maybe they hadn't been using in the past. And in this case, we see a significant year-over-year jump from 67% of all Australians 12 and over last year up to 74% saying that they have used some form of online audio in the month before we called them. The number is very, very large, nearly as large as the total monthly number for the weekly numbers. And again, we see this continuous upward march. So we're now up to 66% of all Australians aged 12 and over, now 2/3 of all Australians saying that they've used online audio in some form in the last week. So right from the jump here, we see it's a big year for increases in uses of online audio. We also asked people if they are using online audio, and bear in mind this was a bigger number of people this year as compared to last year. We asked them to do their best to estimate how much time in the last week they have spent listening to online audio. And the number is down just a little bit from 12 hours and 37 minutes on average last year to 12 hours and 11 minutes this year. But bear in mind that's among a bigger group of people. So the aggregate amount of listening continues to be very, very large and about the same. Still over 12 hours. And so among that very large group using online audio, their self-estimate for how much time they're spending is very, very strong, an average of 12 hours on average for every person. So again, it's a big, strong year for results for online audio. All right, so next let's look at some data about radio, both live and on demand. And here is the trending of the last 3 years in terms of people saying, in general, in the last month, have you listened to any radio content live or on demand? And as you can see, for each of the last 3 years, we're getting the exact same result, a number in the high 80s of percentages, 86 this year percent of everyone aged 12 and over in Australia saying they're consuming radio. And I think this is significant because it was a year of disruption. It was a year, even though things were different with COVID, for many, many Australians, they spent way more time at home. We're traveling less, we're commuting less. And despite that, the number is exactly the same in terms of listening to radio in the last month. We also asked about the last week. And while we see a slight diminishment, again, given the disruptions the last year, given all the things that are going on, the fact the numbers is essentially the same, down a little bit, which again could easily be chalked up to COVID disruptions, etc. Bear in mind that we fielded this study a couple months ago in the first quarter of this year. It's very promising and optimistic data about how powerful radio broadcasting is and remains in Australia. If someone told us that they listened to the streams essentially of online radio, so the content of broadcast radio, but listen to it online, we asked, how are you doing that? How are you listening to radio content online? And you can see you can answer more than one of these, but this is the percentage of people who said, this is the way I consumed online radio. The number one way was from the radio station's website. 46% of those who have listened to streams said that's how they do it. A very close percentage, 44%, saying they use the radio station's app to listen to it. 38% said they use an aggregator app or website, something like TuneIn or others like that. And finally, and as a little preview for some of the stuff we're going to see later in this presentation, now 23% of those who streamed a radio station's content said that they had listened on a smart speaker. So as I implied a little bit earlier, this was an interesting year for in-car consumption because even in Australia where things were more under control than here in the United States, there were disruptions and people spent less time in their cars and were commuting less and spending more time at home. But if we look among the percentage of people who were in a car or being driven in a car or driving a car in the last month, we asked anyone who said that they had, how have they listened to audio? And here you see that radio maintains this very, very dominant position. 84% of anyone who's been in a car in the last month say they use the radio in their car. And that far surpasses the numbers that we get for any of the other ways to consume audio in a car. 41% saying at some point they use their own music collection, presumably CDs or perhaps through their phones. People still hanging in there with those CD players. 39% of Australians who've driven say that they've, in the last month, consumed from a CD player in their car. We asked about online audio streaming services such as Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Music. Now, similar to the CD player, it's 39% in this case as well. Podcasts, and this is an increase up to 30% now, audio usage in the car. So 30% of Australians said they listen to a podcast in their car. And then 16% have used an in-dash system to use audio in their car, something like Apple CarPlay or Android Auto or something like that. And 10% said they'd listen to the streams of AM, FM stations in their cars. And you might wonder about that. Why would they listen to streams of radio in their cars when there's presumably a radio in their car? But there are use cases, listening to radio stations that aren't available in market. Maybe you have a signal deficiency and you can bring it in better through your phone or through a system like that. And so that's a number to watch, that people are also, while they could listen on a radio, some people are also consuming a stream in their cars. On this page, we compare the numbers that we see for you all in Australia in green in each of these pairs to the American number in blue. And you see, most of the numbers are somewhat similar, but there are some differences. Let's start at the top. While radio is very, very strong in the United States, the number is lower, 75% in the United States as compared to the 84% that you see in Australia. Now, part of that is explained down at the bottom of this graph. We have a product in the United States called SiriusXM, which is satellite-delivered radio. It's a really good product that a lot of people use and really like in their cars. It's virtually inconceivable that you would ever get something like this down in Australia. So it's a layer of competition that American radio has that Australia radio doesn't have and is unlikely to ever get, because the costs of shooting satellites up into a sky are very, very expensive, and they can be amortized over all of North America for SiriusXM. So we're talking, something like 400 million people. It would just be very, very challenging to do against your very small population in Australia. So that's part of the reason that radio is lower in the United States as compared to Australia. The other numbers, rather similar. We did see that streaming online is a little bit higher in Australia than what we see in the United States. That may be that the average car on the road is a little newer in Australia by comparison. That's something I would have to look into. But in general, the results are pretty similar with the exception of the radio and then, of course, the SiriusXM thing, as I mentioned. We've been tracking since the beginning whether people have an in-dash system in their car that can receive info and entertainment over the internet. The best known ones would be things like I mentioned earlier, Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, and you see that number continues to march up every year, and it took a big leap forward, up to a quarter of all people now reporting that they have a system like that in the car. Having a system like this in your car doesn't mean you will change your audio consumption behavior while you're driving, but it certainly means that you can change your audio consumption behavior in the car. And so that's why tracking the other data is really important when we look among the total, how is the ability to more readily and more easily use newer options changing things. Now let's move to what I said earlier is really the hot topic in the world of audio, hot around the world, here in the United States, certainly down there in Australia, and that's podcasting. And I'll give you a little preview that if you're watching this because you're interested in podcasting in Australia, you're going to be excited about the numbers you see. We see some significant gains in adoption and usage of podcasting year over year. Starting just with awareness of the term podcasting. Have you ever heard the term podcasting? These numbers have been high every year we've done the study. And you'll see here that they jumped up yet again. Now, 91% of our sample, over 9 in 10 of all Australians aged 12 and over, say, yes, I am familiar with the term podcasting. And it goes up every year. Not only does it go up every year, This is the one area where Australia has consistently tracked ahead of the United States. As you see, awareness of podcasting goes up every year in the United States. This year it went up to 78%, and yet still that's way behind our estimate for Australia at 91%. So in terms of just knowing the term podcasting, Australia has been, every year we've done this study, and remains well out ahead of the American numbers. Now, those of you who've watched this webinar or come to my in-person presentations down there in the past will remember that while awareness has tracked ahead of podcasting consumption in the United States, podcast listening has tracked behind. So let's take a look at how that is going. Well, here is our estimate for monthly podcast listening in Australia. Have you listened to any podcast in Australia in the last month? And you see we report by far the biggest year-over-year increase, from 25% last year all the way up to 37% of Australians now saying that they've listened to a podcast in the last month. And that's a huge year-over-year gain. Perhaps the disruptions and changes of the COVID year push those numbers forward. I have it from many people that the big players in the podcasting space have put immense resources behind the marketing and creation of new podcasts, which doubtlessly have helped push these numbers forward. But we now have a very large percentage, over 1 in 3 Australians now saying that they listened to a podcast in the last month. And how does that number compare to the United States? Well, you now at 37% have an estimate that's exactly the same as what our estimate was at the beginning of 2020 in the United States. So in previous years, the numbers in Australia were tracking about 3 years behind, sometimes even 4 years behind our estimates in the United States. And as you can see, you've caught up dramatically. And now in terms of monthly podcast listening, our estimate is just 1 year behind the number that we see in the United States. And who knows, if you continue this pace, perhaps next year you'll have caught up completely. What about weekly listening? Same story here. We see a big year-over-year increase from 17% last year all the way up to 26%. Over 1 in every 4 Australians aged 12 and over now saying they have listened to a podcast in the last week. And how does that compare to the United States? Well, that number is actually between our 2020 estimate and our 2021 estimate. You could say then that in terms of weekly podcast listening, our Australian estimate is a mere 6 months behind what we see in the United States, and gaining rapidly. So again, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the next year. Perhaps the gap will be closed completely and Australian consumption will catch up to our American estimate. But you see that the gap is really closing, and Australians are adopting podcasting at a very, very fast clip. Where do people tell us they listen to podcasts? Well, this is among that 37% of our sample that say they've listened to a podcast in the last month. And basically what you see here, they can answer yes to any or all, is that people are consuming podcasts in lots of places. 87% naturally saying they consume podcasts at home, but a majority saying at some point they've consumed in their car or truck. Just a slight majority, 51%, say they've listened to podcasts while walking around or on foot. And then sizable percentages saying other things. 39% while riding public transport, a quarter while at work. And this is really dependent on the nature of people's work, whether they can comfortably consume a podcast while also trying to do their work. Really depends on what kind of work they do, maybe what kind of brain they have, and whether they can function doing both things at once. And then even a quarter saying they've consumed podcasts at a gym or while working out. And that's something that has long been seen sort of as the domain of music listening. And now we're seeing that a quarter of podcast listeners say that they take that time when they often have the availability to consume audio, now consuming podcasts in that location. We also ask people what device they use the most to listen to their podcasts. And we see some bigger changes year over year. This is trending down, and this is the percentage that in every year we've seen the overwhelming majority of people say the main device they use is a smartphone or tablet, basically some sort of digital portable device, probably in most cases people's phones. Year over year, we saw a little bit of a comeback for the computer. We're thinking that maybe because people were spending more time at home and working from home, and so maybe spending more time in front of a computer as compared to years past. And we do see a nice bump up, the highest number we've seen for an in-car entertainment system, something we only added as an option to the questionnaire a couple of years ago in 2019, now up to 8%, and that's something to keep our eyes on. But still, by and large, the overwhelming majority of people say they're mostly listening on their phones. And this will be one that will be interesting to track next year as things, we hope, we think, go back to more normal, and we'll see if those things normalize as well. And then finally, a question we've been asking every year in the study: if you listen to any podcasts in the last week, how many do you estimate you've listened to? On average, people said 5. So even as that number of people who say they've listened to any podcast has grown, the number of podcasts they say they've listened to continues to be very stable. And so you can see the aggregate amount of podcast listening has clearly grown very dramatically because we have a much bigger number of people listening, and they're still saying, even with all these new people, that they're listening to 5 podcasts in the last week. So this means the aggregate amount of podcast listening has clearly grown very dramatically year on year, and there's just a lot more consumption of podcasts going on. And so this will be very interesting to watch as we continue to track it forward year by year. So now let's move on to smart speakers, which of course is the other hot topic with podcasting in the audio space. And we see a big jump in smart speaker ownership year on year, from 17% of Australians saying they had a smart speaker last year up to 26% here in 2021. Again, I think it's very plausible to think that a year when people spent more time at home and were sort of filling the space in their homes with more time there, that triggered adoption of smart speakers. And so we see now a quarter of all Australians saying that they have a smart speaker, a big year-on-year increase. How does that compare to our numbers in the United States? Well, again, it's catching up. You see, your 26% is just 1 point behind our estimate for last year in the United States in 2020 at 27%. You closed the gap quite a bit. And so you're now just over 1 year behind the estimate in the United States. So the general theme of this presentation, Australia really catching up to the American numbers really across the board in terms of these digital audio devices and services and using all of them. What brand are people acquiring? Overwhelmingly, from our estimate, it's a Google branded product. Google Nest jumps to 24%. That's the overwhelming majority of anyone who says they own any smart speaker say they have a Google smart speaker. We see a small rise in the Amazon number, a continued very, very small number for Apple. But unlike what we see in the United States, where Alexa is the leader in the category with Google in second place, in Australia, overwhelmingly, if people are acquiring smart speakers, it's coming from Google. We've also been tracking, if you own a smart speaker, how many do you own? So bear in mind, we showed this big year-on-year increase in people owning any smart speakers. Among that group, how many do they own? And you can see a lot more people are owning a lot more. So now over on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that on average, if you own any, you own 1.9 smart speakers, up from 1.7 last year. And fully a quarter of those who have any smart speakers say they have 3 or more in their households. So you see a big jump in people who say they have any smart speakers. Among that big group, you have increases in people saying that they have multiple smart speakers. So it was clearly a very big year for smart speaker adoptions. If you had one, perhaps you got more. And if you got a first one, maybe you already got a second one in this year where a lot more people were spending a lot more time at home. We can compare that number to the American number. So the top bar here is the number I just showed you for Australia in 2021. The bottom bar is our American estimate. And you see here, you're a little bit behind, but getting very close. A slightly smaller number of people saying that they have 3 or more smart speakers, but still on average, the numbers are very similar. 1.9 on average among smart speaker owners in Australia compared to 2.2 on average in the United States. So given this pattern of Australian data lagging what we see in the United States, it's a safe prediction that smart speakers will continue to grow going into this year and through this year. And we'll likely see growth when we do the Infinite Dial Australia 2022. Our final main section here is about online audio streaming services and the brands in the space. So first, we just asked about awareness of the major brands, and you see that the numbers remain very high for some, and we saw some big increases in awareness for some other brands. So Spotify is very much the leader. You'll see on all the graphs we have by streaming services in Australia. Now, 92% of the Australian population aged 12 and over say, yeah, I know that brand name. I've heard of Spotify. Closely trailed by Apple Music, down a little bit year on year, but still clearly the second brand. With YouTube Music, which we reconfigured a bit as they've reconfigured their offering. So we asked it in a new way, and that debuts in this new way at 81%, just behind Apple's number. We saw a big increase in awareness for Amazon Music, from a number in the high 40s all the way up to 64%. And keep your eye as we go forward with usage numbers coming up in a couple graphs, and we'll see if that tracks along with the increase in awareness. This is simply, do you know the brand? Not necessarily, do you use it? And SoundCloud, which we've been tracking now for a couple of years, now crosses half of all Australians. 51% of Australians aware of SoundCloud, up 5 percentage points from what we saw last year. How do those numbers compare to awareness in the United States? You see that, again, they're similar, but awareness across the board higher for Spotify, Apple, and YouTube in Australia as compared to the numbers we see in the United States. The only one where the number's higher in the United States is Amazon Music, where, as I mentioned earlier, for instance, usage of Amazon smart speakers are higher than in the United States. And even all of Amazon's services have been available to Americans for a number of more years than they have been available in Australia. So I think we see some trailing elements of that here. But with the exception of Amazon, awareness of these other brands higher across the board in Australia as compared to what we see in America. We also track by brand. If you use that brand in the last month, are you using a free service or are you paying for a subscription? And there's a real story here as jumps off the screen immediately. Spotify isn't just the most used, it's by far among these three the one that people are likeliest to pay for a subscription. So our estimate is 2/3 of Spotify users are paying for that subscription, then getting away from any advertising, and only 1/3 are using the free service, the ad-supported service, primarily. And so Spotify, as you can see, is very different from our estimates for YouTube or SoundCloud, where overwhelmingly users of those brands are getting ads and using the free service that's ad-supported. Very different from what we see for Spotify. But here's our estimate for weekly usage. Have you used any of these streaming services in the last week? And here's where, as was the case last year, Spotify is way, way out ahead of anybody else. 42% of everyone in Australia saying they've used Spotify in the last week. That would be either the free or the subscription product, a number far surpassing any others. Way back in second place is our estimate for YouTube. It's 16%. And there's really no change in the percentage of Australians saying they're using Apple Music, SoundCloud, or Amazon Music. And I'll point out the Amazon Music number only because I pointed out the awareness gain for Amazon Music. In terms of weekly usage, we see no influence from the increased awareness. People are more aware of Amazon Music, but no more likely to say that they've used Amazon Music in the last week. We also asked about using YouTube for music or music video. Interestingly, that number trended down for the second year in a row, from 48% 2 years ago, now 45% last year, and now 39% this year. And that will be one that's interesting to track. We're not seeing that level of diminishment in our American numbers. And you have to wonder, as Spotify continues to go up in Australia, if it's obviating usage of YouTube for this purpose. And it's unlikely that Google just sits back and takes it, so it could be game on as YouTube, if YouTube is indeed seeing any kind of dropping in the numbers. But this is definitely one to watch as we go forward. So I'm going to finish with some observations in general on what we saw. Again, I'll reiterate, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. I have a team of people watching that box and answering questions as they come in. So observation number one, despite the disruptions of 2020, or frankly, more likely on account of those disruptions, digital audio options grew at a significant pace year on year. That, of course, is the big finding from today. Big gains in podcasting, big gains in smart speaker usage. And we'll never know if they would have happened anyway, but it seems likely that all the unusual things about 2020 in the broader world led to increased adoption of these digital options. Podcasts in particular making a big leap forward, now just mere months behind the figures we see in the USA and Canada. So if you're in the podcasting industry anywhere, if you're in the podcasting industry in Australia, you're very excited about what you saw today. Podcasting having a big year in Australia, and with more people listening, that will lead to a virtuous cycle with more creation, more money coming into this space, all good things for podcasting. So that's awfully exciting. Similarly, we saw a big year-on-year increase for smart speakers, likely propelled again by people staying at home more. And I want to take this opportunity to announce something else exciting, which is the people at CRA and a group of companies that they're working with have commissioned from Edison Research the Smart Audio Report Australia. You may be aware of a study we've done over the years with NPR, the public broadcaster here in the United States, called the Smart Audio Report. We are going to be showing the results of basically a parallel study in Australia coming up in May. And we're very excited about this, and it's a very deep level look at smart speakers, everything people do on smart speakers, but in particular, the usage of audio on smart speakers. And similar to what you've been watching today, we'll compare and contrast to what you saw in Australia, compare it and contrast it to our American numbers. And I've already seen some of the information. It's going to be really interesting and exciting to watch. Despite the advancements in digital usage and all the disruptions of the last year, broadcast radio and the content it creates continues to serve enormous numbers of Australians each week and each month. And I think this is very, very significant that what we're seeing is that people adopt digital, they're using digital to adopt the content from broadcast radio, or they're just adding on this time spent with digital options to the time they're also spending with broadcast audio. So we're not really seeing digital tearing into broadcast content time or usage. What we're really seeing more is just a flowering of audio across the board and people listening to everything more. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for staying tuned through all of it. If you're watching live, again, the Q&A box is open and we will stick around for a while answering any questions that you might have over the next several minutes. But no matter when you're watching this, if you want a copy of the deck that you just saw, it is posted now live at edisonresearch.com. So just go to edisonresearch.com and a link to download the deck is on the homepage. And with that, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. And like I said, hopefully I'll see you down in Australia next year.